Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we are going to be talking about accountability over free speech. We're going to be looking at the same principles that currently exist over financial reporting, and our guest today is a leader in that field, and asking why we can't apply those principles to the fair free speech conversation. Talking us through this topic is Professor Alan Jagolinzer, who is actually one of the emerging leading figures in the fight against disinformation. He's organising the Cambridge Disinformation Summit that's taking place in late July at the University of Cambridge. But it's his journey to this point that I find particularly interesting, and I think you might too as well. After almost a decade in the US Air Force, he has been a professor of accounting at Stanford, the University of Colorado, and now Cambridge Judge Business School, where he heads the accounting faculty department at Cambridge University. It's the disinformation around stock and market manipulation that led him down this rabbit hole, and he's now developing research and curriculum on this subject. So let's start. Hi, Alan. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for hosting me, Rafi.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I know you are particularly busy because you've got a very big event that we're going to come to later on the show that is coming up in July. And so I know your schedule is pretty hectic at the moment. So thanks for finding time to speak to us. Before we get into our fascinating topic today, I want to ask you the question, as I do every single episode. What was your first ever social media platform?
So I'm a late adopter to social media. I think does America Online chat rooms count? Because I spent some time there when it started, when we were doing the dial up with the telephones and 20 different phone numbers. I think my first formal social media, as I think of it, was Facebook, but I was pretty late into Facebook. And
Nice.
I'm no longer on Facebook, so I quit that a while ago.
So maybe I should update the question as well of like, what's your recent social media platform as well as your first? Are you active on anything in particular?
So right now I'm active on Twitter. I have a Twitter account and I have a LinkedIn account, and those are my only formal social media account presence right now.
Nice. So I'm going to ask you the question that I'm sure many people are thinking. You are organizing what is shaping up to be a really interesting summit about disinformation. You're assembling really interesting people who are talking about it from all kind of walks of life, from all backgrounds, and all parts of the world. So it's fascinating that you are involved in leading this, but really the question that you mentioned just before we hit record that you often get is what led you to being in this position? You know, it's not where you started, right?
It isn't. I guess it kind of is. I mean, accounting is inherently an information science, but we've often felt like it was related to fraud and now greenwashing. That's our typical sort of landscape where we explore disinformation. We've used different terminology. And I think I was pretty content there dealing with fraud and trying to prevent fraud with financial reporting standards or improving audit practices as some examples, or thinking in terms of better regulatory infrastructure. The issue was the pandemic hit. And during that window, I started seeing this proliferation that's always been there. I just was much more sensitive to it, of just completely bad information floating through. And I started watching patterns unfold throughout the world. And they looked very much like the fraud stuff that we were seeing and how it operates in my field. And I just had a whole bunch of questions because I literally am seeing it kill people. The pandemic, bad information about the pandemic killed people. Bad information around nationalistic pride is killing people in war, in genocidal type activities, things like that. And I just was wondering how does this evolve, and what are other people doing to mitigate it? And more importantly, I saw that a lot of the damage is happening outside of the span of our control. We have a very, very, very rigid system about communication within my field. But when you move into the open space, which would be Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, there's almost no infrastructure there for it. There's almost no accountability for it. And it led me to wonder, why isn't that system more accountable when arguably there's significantly more societal damage from that than there might be in a financial fraud. And that finally led me to a bunch of people who were answering questions we're not answering in my field with our research. So our research I found very limiting, and I needed to reach out to social psychologists, psychiatrists, authoritarian studies professors, people in practice doing regulatory work or thinking in terms of digital services regulation. And a lot of this project was from me asking questions to try to understand the world we're operating in around information.
And so you're coming very much from quite strict, or let's say defined parameters where it comes to financial reporting, financial accountability. In mature markets and societies, you can't just say anything you want, or people who do say anything they want, especially if it's inaccurate or misleading or manipulation. There are consequences to that. And so that's very much the world that you've been working in and have been forming and shaping. And so what was that kind of first moment where you took yourself out of that world and then applied that to other things that were going on around? Was there like a specific aha moment?
Yeah, I guess there were several. I mean, one of them would be the death of my nephew, who I would say died from disinformation around COVID and the efficacy of vaccines. Another is sort of watching the decay of democracy in many jurisdictions. I'm from the United States, as you noted. So for me, I was particularly sensitive to the rise of the polarization. Personally, I have many colleagues with whom I used to engage, some of whom I trusted my life to. And we used to be able to debate almost anything. We would fly for hours and hours and hours together, and any topic was open and we could have a polite debate about it. Now, if I introduce any counter data, even if it's evidence-based counter data, it would move into ad hominem attack. And in some cases, it got very angry, and you can see in some of these societal pockets, it even moves towards violence. And I just did not understand that. And I sensed, well, and then it was easy for me to sit there and chase the actors who were sort of behind all of it and watch their incentives and see how their political gameplay. I mean, we do, we think in terms of games and game theory, and whenever we're talking about accounting fraud or financial fraud, we're thinking in terms of incentives behind it, who has the incentives. And so there are very obvious financial incentives. And when you map that over into the social and political space, it's quite easy to see who is the power base behind it, what incentives they have. It's often very much power oriented, often financially motivated. And then you look at some of how they operate an information system, and it is a system. They leverage a lot of people, they leverage a lot of messaging, they target specific audiences with micro-targeting, and it's a very sophisticated infrastructure that is designed to exploit for gain. And trying to understand that and unpack it, it just led me to wonder, why can't we have some more accountability in that space? What would it look like? Why, stated differently, why is it that we have an ecosystem in financial reporting that is so structured and we have almost nothing of a similar nature in that space? And that's sort of where the genesis of all this in my mind went.
But I think you've articulated there a journey that I think many people, many listeners will connect with, about how what they're seeing, the actors maybe not as kind of knowledgeable in terms of the techniques that you're describing there, but you're seeing something that is a cause for worry. You're seeing the direction it's going in. But in your instance, you're coming from a world that has very kind of defined parameters. What are those when you say accountability in your space? What does that mean in the world that you come from when it comes to financial reporting? What does accountability look like?
Well, this is a great question, because it also get into the limitations of it. We have financial reporting standards, and I worked as an academic fellow at one of the standard setters, which is the International Accounting Standards Board based in London. And there are very specific guidelines about how one, as a manager of a corporation or a government agency in certain jurisdictions, are supposed to communicate around financial health. We have definitions of things like assets, liabilities, earnings, income. And then we have very strict rules around how one derives a computation around it. Then we have audits, independent audits. We have audit committees. We have shareholders who have a financial stake, and they have an opportunity to do lawsuits, civil lawsuits, to hold management accountable. We also have activist investors who can hold management accountable. We have analysts who can hold management accountable. And most importantly, arguably, is we have securities regulators who, in some cases, the United States particularly, they can come after civil penalties, and they can even, in rare cases, come after criminal penalties. So all of this infrastructure is there presumably to be a preventative tool and to say, hey, the costs of you manipulating the system and falsely reporting within the system are high. Therefore, the probability of you doing that presumably would diminish. What was interesting about this construct, when I was trying to get my head around what could be applied in, hypothetically, some social media or journalistic space, some news outlets, for example, I realized that it's kind of, in some ways, limiting, because a lot of the people in that infrastructure, first of all, some of the enforcement isn't tangible enough. So a lot of the enforcement we're seeing, even, for example, in the bank crisis, is financial penalties, and it's not clear that that's enough of a disincentive. And now that we have, for example, billionaires who are running some of these operations, if you find them several $1 million, either that's coming out of shareholders, or it's coming out of insurance policies, or it's just coming out of discretionary spend, and it's not clear it has that much of an enforcement effect. But that's kind of where I began, and I started realizing, maybe we could have a mechanism of accountability in that kind of context. I'm also realizing, though, that accountability in that context is limiting, because a lot of this is really in a belief system structure on the recipients. Stated differently, right now we have auditors who are saying, in some cases, we might have financial auditors who come out and say, hey, management's not being accurate, or we've asked management to make changes, or the regulator might say that. But if the management team is personality cult-like and can draw a lot of buzz around them, and there are ample examples of these magnificent, charismatic leaders floating around, and we don't need to name them, then they may actually have believers who simply believe them, and they ignore the mechanism that's trying to evaluate or validate this information. And that's what's led me, that piece is what led me down a path of talking to psychologists and psychiatrists to understand the belief structures that's way outside my domain.
And I think what you've described there, I'm in no way an expert or knowledgeable on the accounting profession at all, but you described a kind of shared understanding, shared principles, shared foundation with which people can then agree or disagree on. But then when you apply that to the online social media speech, hate speech context, or just speech generally, it's not the same, right? It's no surprise to anyone listening that the principles, like you mentioned, of kind of the underlying acceptance of what's the truth or not, or how do you build a conversation or a healthy debate off of that, which is the underpinning and what we need for a healthy society. So how do you then start when you're applying those principles, and you've given it a lot of thought and you've spoken to a lot of people? How do you begin to apply those principles, knowing that those two situations are not the same?
That's what I'm still trying to figure out. And that's one of the reasons why I built this summit that you mentioned in July. There are many questions I have that I don't fully have resolution for. And I think there are experts in pockets who can kind of get together and think through all of this as a cohesive or a collective implementation strategy of something that deals with this. And I call this, in my head, this is the ecosystem problem stated, which is related to what you just said. For example, we have a self-selection. We have some people who want validated information. And when I was speaking to fact checkers at Africa Check, they're doing considerably detailed work to try to validate information that's coming through infrastructures. But I asked them, how do you get that in front of the people who don't seek it out? And that was the analogy in my space. In financial reporting, most people presumably are sophisticated investors. They presumably want validated information so they can make reasonably sound financial decisions. But there's this entire community out there who not only don't seek it out, but if you present it to them, they might actually reject it outright and get angry and go into ad hominem attack. And so part of this is, how do we get them to understand that this is a societal benefit to have a validation infrastructure? How do we develop common trust around that infrastructure? Who can be responsible for doing this sort of work in a way such that people buy into the system collectively, and people realize the value? And I sense right now that some of that's going to have to come through iterations of learning around media literacy. I have, for example, a gentleman from Finland who's coming into the summit who helped build some of Finland's educational infrastructure for grade schools. And my understanding is both Finland and Estonia have a very vibrant education with children on propaganda, how disinformation campaigns work, and how to think about sourcing information. My wife is a librarian at a grade school here in Cambridge, and she was talking about teaching students how to do citations. And I said, well, are you also teaching them that not all citations, even if they're properly cited, not all of them are legitimate? So how does one go beyond citing work and actually doing validation of the citations and triangulation and things like that? So I think it's a system around that. I think one is getting people to understand the value of skepticism, the value of disciplined, evidence-based triangulation of sourcing, some understanding of incentives and how to sit back and evaluate, take a pause and evaluate when somebody's communicating a message to me, what's in it for them? How could they possibly be exploiting me or my family? When they claim that they're empowering me, are they in fact exploiting me? And then what infrastructure can we use to kind of validate what they're communicating to me and do an assessment of its credibility? And so, and then you get into accountability, which is then what do you do about the people who are exploiting the system? And who's responsible for that? And we're going to do a panel on platform accountability versus free speech rights. Where's the line? At what point are we violating free speech, which I'm a huge proponent of free speech, but I'm also a huge proponent of accountability around intentionally harmful speech. And I think both are required in order for us to have a safe environment. And in fact, I would argue that's exactly what we have in financial reporting. Is that combination.
And I think whenever the discussion of accountability comes up, it's not long until we discuss the principles or the oversight that's needed. And those who are less enthusiastic about this will often use the argument of, well, oversight means controlling. That they are trying to control my speech, you're trying to control free speech. And so how do you counter that to people that say those things?
That's a challenge because I'm empathetic to it. Like, I understand it. I don't want people telling me that I can't communicate cleanly, but I also feel like I'm responsible for the harm of what I'm communicating, and that I have some accountability for making sure that before I communicate publicly, I've done my research, I've done my homework. Like, I understand that there's some fundamental truth, and I've also evaluated my intentions behind it. So I don't think it's safe for us to just say anything. If you take the analog into financial reporting, and if you could just say anything, then I could claim anything to my investors. Bernie Madoff did this, right? And if you take it over here, we had a scandal with Carillion, which even went through. So Carillion was part of this entire infrastructure. I mean, they were audited by a Big Four accounting firm, regulation, et cetera, and yet they lied on, allegedly, I guess. Well, I guess they went bankrupt for it, but they had a scandal, and in that process, hospitals here weren't built and now are over budget, and railways infrastructure. So I mean, societal infrastructure was was delayed, damaged, not built, over budget, things like that. So there's a societal spillover to that, and I think we have to have some accountability about the credibility of information. And in our space, we do it all the time, and I think people are okay with that. I think people expect that we want honesty around sales of homes. We have to do. I can speak to the United States. When you sell a home, you have to list whether you have radon and whether you have lead paint, and you're held accountable for that. And if you lie about that, then kids might be harmed, children. So I hear the notion of, I should be allowed to say what I think, but not if it leads to, or if it's I should say, not if it's intentionally there to try to create violent campaigns or to destabilize infrastructure that's supportive of society. I find that appalling. This is where it gets into a gray area. Is like, who is going to make these decisions about where's the societal damage? And that's part of the discussion I'm hoping we're going to tee up when we bring in the discussion here. And for the audience, we're bringing in a constitutional law professor from Cambridge. We're bringing in a securities law professor from University of Chicago. And then we're bringing in a bunch of policymakers who've thought about this work, thinking about, well, how do we protect free speech and hold accountable the speech within these platforms? And I think that's an important dialogue to have. And who would be the trust agent to pull that off, such that people are like, okay, I see why we need some sort of boundaries around things like hate speech, as an example, or the rhetoric that might might inspire terrorism is another example.
Right. And I'm glad you raised the kind of regulations or the institutions that need to be built around that, or that need to work on this, because you mentioned Finland. Estonia is often a country that's cited as being very technologically advanced, and in terms of the the awareness of their societies, they've done a great job. But what can governments, what are those roles, what are the regulations that they can bring in, again keeping in the back of our mind the issue about oversight and overstepping that, but I think there's a general acceptance that some things can be done and some things should be done. What role do they have to play?
I think some of it could be almost, I think in terms of audit, I may be anchored to my own profession and some of the infrastructure we have, and I'm trying to decouple from it. But the notion of sort of an independent audit, and some of the discussions I'm having right now are with policymakers around auditing algorithms, for example. So what are the algorithm structures in the platforms? When do they amplify, inspiring terroristic thought, things like that? So is there a way to hold platforms accountable? Another one would be to have the ability to sue them. So if there's a harmed party, you saw that a little bit in the Fox News case, right? So there are harmed parties suing Fox News, alleging, actually one of them won a large settlement, but the allegations are that they were harmed by this, and Fox News is accountable. That's a very high threshold to meet, and yet they still met the threshold, at least by evidence of the settlement. I think the opportunity to allow those types of things to happen, and what you get out of that is, even if there isn't necessarily damages at the end, there is discovery. And a lot of this is transparency that we're lacking. So for example, right now, my understanding with Twitter is we don't have transparency into their infrastructure. They've shut down the transparency. So some of the mechanisms are simply not necessarily that they're going to pay damage or that they're going to change their systems, but that we at least can understand what they're doing. And so even if it's a transparency move, I think that inherently is one element of accountability, potentially allowing for more opportunities for alleged harm party claimants to make some sort of claim, which would allow discovery and potential damages, I think would be helpful. I do think some regulatory interventions would be helpful. We have this with antitrust. We have this again in financial reporting. We have plenty of it. So this is the space where I'm in, but I admit that I haven't thought through all the scenarios. Again, this is one of the reasons why One of the things I learned when I was at Stanford is I never pretend to know everything. And in fact,
Mm-hmm.
what I see is that I can collect people who know a lot of different things. And so the ideation around this summit was based off of what I observed when I was at Stanford, which was never claim you're the expert, bring the experts to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And everybody's got little pieces and pockets of experience. And collectively, then we have the expertise to try to sort through this and come up with creative ideas as a collaborative.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I want to take you to kind of a slightly different, segment of this topic. When it comes to manipulation, online influence operations, often the conversation, or traditionally the conversation, has been around elections or big protests, or kind of those areas or threats that are of major concern to governments and intelligence organizations. Because of where you're coming from, I'd imagine you come across more, not exclusively, but many corporate examples where the motivation is an important aspect to consider as part of this conversation, where we often hear, okay, but who's doing it, but also why are they doing it? You're coming at this from an interesting angle because clearly you can see and map out, well, this is for financial gain. They're trying to manipulate something in some way for financial gain. How are you seeing this manifesting in the private sector, corporate entities, companies being affected? And can you give any examples to that?
Yeah, I think there's several. So I'm building curriculum around this so that we can get this into the business schools. And this gets into what I would consider this specific topic is like the direct risks of disinformation. With respect to corporations, I mean, they're victims to short seller tactics to try to manipulate stock price. It doesn't even have to be short sellers. It could be any investor. It could also be a political actor now who's trying to diminish their value to gain political influence over them. And you can see this with, for example, Anheuser-Busch, the Bud Light campaign. They took a social position, and now they're getting a lot of political backlash. And
Mm-hmm.
my inference on that is it's trying to sway some sort of political outcome. It's leveraging that from a political perspective, and it's also harming their share price from what I've seen. So I think there are these sort of direct threats. I could see it also with a competitor in some scenarios. My understanding, and I'm not an expert in this, you probably have a lot more knowledge of this, but my understanding is it is quite inexpensive to hire bots. And one could presumably say, hey, this lab grown meat project that you're doing, it causes cancer hypothetically. And to be fair, I'm not making that claim, but I can imagine somebody who is not into lab grown meat or a competitor of that as one example, or a pharmaceutical product that has just come out to make false claims or semi true claims to even manufacture broader claims than what the evidence suggests. I think would be really easy to do. And see, these are some of the direct threats. You could also see it if you wanted to tarnish the reputation of a particular leader within a corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sensing that there is now potential political internal politics and or the potential risk that we're going to try to pull out. Rafi is CEO of company X. For whatever reason, I disagree with who he is, so I'm going to go after his reputation
Mm-hmm.
and try to get him into the media, and I'm going to yank him out or have him resign, such that we can make some sort of takeover of his role, things like that. So those are some of the direct risks with the disinformation. I also talk about indirect risks, which are largely, many of them are geopolitical.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the disinformation issues are unintentional, but they're happening because the environment around you is shifting and you're not paying attention. And the classic example most recently is the bank runs. So there were some concerns about valid concerns, but there were concerns about the liquidity of Silicon Valley Bank as an example.
Mm-hmm.
That hits social media. Misinformation then starts generating about whether it's truly solvent. And there's a whole lot of debate offline we could get into about that, and a lot of literature that's already been written about it. But you can imagine where it would be super easy to get information out in that environment around another bank and its liquidity.
Mm-hmm.
And another classic example was BP with Rosneft. So for years, they held a long position in Rosneft, a very sizable position in the Russian oil enterprise. And it's not hard to suggest that Vladimir Putin's campaign in Ukraine was I shouldn't say was, is backed by disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And the geopolitical outcome of that is that BP, who I would presume was having a profitable large stake, had the CEO on the board of Rosneft. Now they have to take a 25, if I recall, I think the number was a $25 billion write down of Rosneft, and the CEO comes off the board. And maybe they found a buyer rather, for that investment. I don't know where that sits, but these are the kinds of things you could see where disinformation can affect companies, which then matriculates into, or drips down into stock price effects, investment portfolios. Another one would be stranded assets. If, for example, there's disinformation happening in country X, and that then spills over into civil conflict, well, it may not be safe for you to utilize resources in that country that you've had, so they're stranded, or they could be nationalized assets, or there could be supply chain disruption, things like that. So these are the indirect effects of disinformation that I see in the corporate space.
Amazing. And I love the way that you've broken it down or separated into direct and indirect. But you've also incredibly diligently just gone through so many of the examples that people are seeing, so many of the examples that I think people are becoming more aware of. And we're having so many of those kind of conversations. And unfortunately, so many examples that we are uncovering on a day-to-day basis. And I think false information and being misleading isn't necessarily new. But as you said, the barriers to create fake account, bot networks, impersonation accounts is now incredibly low for quite a few reasons. And so whether it's to spread chaos generally or to reach specific, targeted micro communities as well, is now becoming easier. And those methods we're seeing are evolving to be able to cause more harm and more chaos. Really scary.
And if I can add, they're so effective. There's so little accountability for this, and they're so effective that those who used to want to hold people accountable are now fighting adding new accountability. So this is infiltrating senior leaders in governments, and this is infiltrating, like police systems and judicial systems and military systems. So those who used to be strong advocates of accountability are now fighting against additional measures for accountability. It's really dangerous. It's insidious.
And I personally find that quite surprising because the same techniques and methods that you might be witnessing right now against your competitors and your opposition can easily be applied and are being applied to you as well. So it seems kind of surprising that there isn't the motivation and the willing to do more of that.
Well, I'll interrupt for a second. That's one of the reasons I reached out to the social psychologists and the psychiatrists, because they helped me understand this. I was like, I'm so cynical and skeptical, and I see the incentives, and I'm able to observe this, but I haven't figured out why. But many people don't, and they're helping me understand it. And they claim that we are all susceptible to this. They claim this.
Interesting.
Every one of us. So
I always enjoy our conversations because it's interesting to see the muscle that you've developed over so many years, and now the way that you're applying it to something that is so important and is affecting so many people. So it's great to see you and the kind of efforts that is going into that, which does lead us to the summit that's later in July. Tell us what it is, what are you achieving, who's involved, and how can people find out more?
Yeah, so we're hosting this Disinformation Summit 27 and 28 July. We're hosting it in King's College Hall at Cambridge. There is still a limited availability of in-person registrations, and we're doing an online live feed as well with some video recording for those who want to visit it afterwards because of time zone differences. What's most important about it was, because of all of these questions, the genesis was all the questions I had, and my need to reach out to so many different people, from journalism to authoritarian studies to regulatory public policy, accounting. Anyway, there are so many people involved in this. Social AI, we have people in there. We have computer scientists who are working on text analysis to identify disinformation flags. I just had a whole series of questions, and some of them we've discussed already. So including, how do we do inoculation? Can we do that? How do we platform accountability how good are we at audit and fact checking? Can we really do that well? Is it effective? These are the types of, and what are the incentives? Who's profiteering from this? Because that's something that's missing in a lot of the dialogue is
Mm-hmm.
why would I go out and try to intentionally lie to you?
Mm-hmm.
What's in it for me? And who are the
Mm-hmm.
actors, and thinking through the incentive structures. So we have all these questions baked in, and I've reached out to globally leading experts. And what was fascinating was that people were reaching out to me to talk about just the social ecosystem behind this. When I started putting this word out and building a web page and then bringing in colleagues, this is backed by University of Notre Dame, University of Zurich. We've got the Cambridge Psychometric Center involved. We've got other agencies involved. Once we started putting our hands around this, people started coming to us saying, hey, this is interesting because we haven't talked to people in business, and you bring a different perspective in, and we need your knowledge on how to think about X. And X could be accounting or audit, and X was also how to do financial fact checking in Africa. These are the types of things where they could leverage our learning. And I know that we could leverage some of the data that's out there in social media for our work, things like this. So we've assembled like a who's who of thought leaders in journalism, authoritarian studies, and across these fields. A keynote from Frances Haugen, who is an advocate of transparency and accountability for social media. She is most widely known as a Facebook whistleblower. So she's coming out to talk a little bit about that experience. But I think the key here, and I think what's really important, is this isn't just a convention to talk. This is a convention to find synergy and to help support each other's projects. Case in point, I spoke to a gentleman who's working with Canadian regulators on doing their Digital Services Act. And one of the things that I think is in that act might be, some of the accountability things that we were discussing. And my field has a lot of expertise in accountability structures. And so that allowed us to have a conversation about some of the things you and I discussed. Could we develop accountability structures? What could they look like? What are you doing in accounting? Would that apply over there? If not, why not? What are the weaknesses in your structures?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping to borrow from this collective for the work I plan to do, which is business school curriculum. And I'm hoping that others are going to leverage the people in the room so they can enhance some of the work they're doing, and we can get out of our silos and attack these problems holistically, because I see this as probably the largest existential societal problem. It, to me, is the accelerant for all the sub problems, which might include climate and inequities and genocidal thought war. I mean, all this stuff runs on a disinformation engine, financial fraud. So I think if we can get a group of people acknowledge that we're in an ecosystem, so that we have a chore to find out how we can penetrate the other ecosystems who don't want to listen to us, what can we do to help work on this problem collectively? And I think there could be a lot of value from that work that follows after the summit.
Amazing. And if you're listening to the Too Much Disinformation podcast, I'm in no doubt that you're going to find value from the summit itself. You can attend in person. I'm going to be there. Looking forward to joining. Really can't wait. But also you can attend virtually as well. And so we'll include links in the show notes of how you can attend and how you can join. Or in fact, if you're listening to this after the event, how you can go back and see some of the sessions. So it's going to be of huge value. Before we finish, I have to ask you the question that we ask every guest that comes on the show, to end on one example that is good, one example that's bad, and one example that is fake in the online space as you're seeing it now.
I'm going to talk a little bit more general. I don't know if you want specifics, but the good part I've seen from the online is the ability to reach people. I've been able to communicate with people I never would have communicated with via social media access. So some people would argue it's bad because we now can get access to literally anybody in the world almost, but it allows me, for example, to convene a summit of this nature. And it allows me to learn from people who I think have value to help me, understand more. Another good piece, I know you asked for one, but another good piece is it also allows to triangulate data. So we can get multiple sources around the same question, and we can then think through which one of these seems proper and why are they not aligned.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to triangulate is key for evidential type learning. I think the bad is anonymity and the hostility that comes from anonymity. People feel they're empowered to basically blurt out the worst and the worst and the worst of the depths of their anger and their vitriol when they're anonymous, or when they at least perceive themselves to be anonymous. And I find that appalling and highly damaging. And often it's intentionally done. And often it's now, as you know, leveraging bots to do that. And I find that very, 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 very toxic.
Well,
What was the
the
last one?
anonymity leads to the lack of accountability, which I think brings us full
Yes.
circle.
Yeah.
The last one is fake.
Right now, what I'm seeing is fake. I sense it's fake. This gets into the incentives. I'm seeing a lot of people who, I'm thinking in terms of politics right now, I'm seeing a lot of political actors who I suspect are facing potential criminal penalties. And so I'm seeing a lot of incentives for them to lie. And they're manipulating their social media accounts with coordinated propaganda to help deflect away attention to their own potential criminal liability. They're doing it to help minimize the potential of them being criminally prosecuted. So that's the fake. And I think it's probably safer to not name names, but I think it's pretty obvious. And I suspect that strategy is utilized across jurisdictions. I'm going to say too, to that point, one of the things about the summit is I'm trying not to focus on a specific case in there. I suspect some of our speakers will, but when you talk about Ukraine or United States or British or, pick country X or problem Y, these are just anecdotes of similar patterns, and the patterns keep reappearing. And the structures are what I want to talk about, the systems, because that's where the learning is. We can sit here all day and spin around US politics or Russian politics or Russian aggression or whatever. But I think that takes us a little bit out of the larger picture of studying, well, what does that setting tell me about the patterns and the strategies that are being applied across, including in accounting fraud. So I'm planning to keep the focus on the structures and the procedures.
Amazing. I encourage everyone to connect with Alan on and follow his stuff on Twitter and on LinkedIn as he assembles the coalition of the interested and the willing, and he's doing his great work in that. Alan, I look forward to seeing you in Cambridge at the summit itself. But in the meantime, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast today and for talking this through. I really found it incredibly rewarding and interesting, fascinating, and I'm sure lots of other people did as well. So have a great day. Thanks for joining us, and for everyone listening, have a great day, everyone. Bye.